Hi everyone, I'm Maha. I recognize a few of you guys on here, but hello to everyone else. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Doria Shafik. She's a famous Egyptian feminist icon that is actually not very well known both in Egypt and abroad. So I'm pulling this from an article called Overlook No More, Doria Shafik, who led Egypt's women's liberation movement. And it's actually from the New York Times segment called Overlooked. For those of you who aren't familiar, a couple of years ago, the New York Times, which is a major newspaper in the United States, decided that its obituaries were filled with too many old white men, and that they were featuring too many old white men that had died in their obituaries, and they really wanted to diversify who they talked about. And so they kind of opened the books of history and decided to pick a few people and write about them. And one of those people was Doria. So the New York Times kind of regretted not printing her original obituary when she died, and they finally printed one for her in 2018. And just kind of on this note, the New York Times actually still has an open comment section about if you think there's anyone in history, Arab or not, whose kind of obituary has ever been overlooked. It might be worth emailing the New York Times and kind of getting them on there. I'm sure someone did this for Doria, and it was really worth it. So here's the article itself. And this is kind of what inspired me to do the forward, because as an Egyptian American, I actually had never heard of Doria Shafik, although I'm pretty interested in women's history and the feminist movements globally. So Doria was born in 1908. She was born in Tanta, which is a smaller town in Egypt, and then she later moved to Alexandria. Her father was a civil servant in the Egyptian government, and just for time frame period wise, Egypt was obviously going through a lot in the 50s, independent governance. And so she moved around a lot, and then when she got to the end of her preliminary schooling, she was told that she could no longer continue schooling because she was a woman, which is something that, of course, many Egyptian women experience, and something that really rattled her. And she thought, you know, it was kind of ridiculous, particularly because she was one of the smartest people in her class. So at this point, she decided to reach out to Huda Sha'rawi, who is also another famous Egyptian icon, not necessarily in the feminist lens, but was kind of well known for her elite status. And she did start a feminist union, but it was very much tied to less the freedom of women and more political freedom from colonialism. So she reached out to Huda Sha'rawi and wrote her a letter and said, you know, I really want to study and I really deserve to study. Like, please help me realize this dream. And so Huda Sha'rawi was able to kind of push her forward for a government scholarship to study at the Sorbonne in Paris. And so that's where Doria ended up going, and found a lot of her life's work and purpose there. So once she got to Paris, she entered the Sorbonne and you know, learned a lot from kind of a Western lens. And upon returning to Egypt, she you know, was struggling to kind of find her place in society. Something that Doria talks a lot about is her middle class background and how that didn't really fit in with the elitism that came with the Egyptian feminist movement at the time. So the thing that she did that was really fascinating was she entered Miss Egypt, which is a beauty pageant. And what was remarkable about her entering was she was actually the first Muslim to enter. And so the beauty pageant was really focused on Westerners entering or Coptic Christians, and there was never a Muslim to enter for the first time. So she won runners up, and this kind of shook her community in the sense of, you know, how could a Muslim woman enter this pageant? And so after doing that, she completes her PhD, and then she comes back and she gets married and has 2 kids. And during this period, she starts 2 magazines, so Bint Nil and La Femme Nouvelle, which is fascinating because I think these 2 magazines really represent the kind of split in both her life and her personalities and the ideas that really founded her view of feminism is kind of this traditional, the daughter of the Nile, her middle-class upbringing, and kind of this new woman, new era, the opportunity for her to study kind of in France. So after she took over La Femme Nouvelle, she took it over from the first wife of King Fouad I, and then she decided to create Bint Nil. And what was fascinating was Bint Nil actually became a union which focused on a space for women to advocate for political rights. And then the reason she kind of started or converted Bint Nia from a magazine into a union was she was met with a lot of pushback from the Union of Egyptian Women that Huda Sha'rawi had founded. And the reason that being was Huda Sha'rawi saw Doria as not elite enough to kind of enter this sphere. And so we can constantly see Doria kind of running into non-intersectionalism in her attempts to kind of find feminism in Egypt. And so that really pushed her to create this space for kind of women from all over Egypt. And then we get to 1951, which is what Doria is actually most famous about. And what fascinates me as a person who has, family in Egypt and a mom in Egypt is I would have never known, or I never knew, that Doria is actually single-handedly, we should thank her for giving women the right to vote in Egypt. So in 1951, her most famous activity that she did as a feminist was run a feminist congress. And she basically took 1,500 other Egyptian women and they stormed Congress or parliament on that day. And essentially she held Congress for 4 hours and refused to leave until they listened to their demands. And this kind of played a key role in ending not only British rule in Egypt, but also bringing a lot of those demands forward during that end to British rule. And a notable thing about this is something that Doria talks about in her book is, it wasn't the way she focused it wasn't that I'm storming Congress. She famously says that there was actually two congresses happening at the same time. One where 50% of the nation wasn't included, and it just happened to be that on that day, both of those congresses were at the same place at the same time, which I always thought was really fascinating because she always kind of, saw her place as a woman in society as crucial and not as an ask or a need. She later goes on to we don't see immediate wins kind of from that ask after the storming of Congress, but after several years and most notably the end of British rule, we begin to see some of those demands be taken out. And most notably 4 years later, women were given the right to vote. And so that was kind of a huge win for Doria. And then obviously at the end of her timeline, there's a fascinating split in her life where she essentially went from being in the spotlight as a feminist icon in Egypt to kind of going into solitude. And a big reason she went into solitude was her criticism of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And that led her to do a hunger strike, which is also famously one of her most notable acts. She held that hunger strike for several days, and eventually in 1975, she actually died of suicide, most famously falling off a balcony, as actually many other Egyptian women have, and maybe possible future afikra topic. And most notably in 2018, Google actually dedicated a doodle to her. Nowadays, many modern Egyptian feminists have attempted to kind of rebuild the independent feminist movement, especially in Egypt, and keep Doria Shafik in her mind. But this is a picture of her breaking her fast after the 8-day hunger strike after her denouncing Gamal Abdel Nasser. And then this is the Google doodle that was dedicated to her. Yeah, so these are a couple of the resources. I learned about her through the New York Times obituary and later through a book by Mona Tahawi that talks about her. But there's a whole digital collection by the American University in Cairo. The AUC Hall is actually where the parliament was in the 50s. And so there is also a monument there for her. And then Egyptian Streets wrote a great article about her, and then there's lots of case studies kind of on the role of protest in feminism and kind of her role in the women's movement. That's it.